Hello, everyone. On behalf of Indian students in the US, supported by India Student Hub, I would like to welcome all of you to today's talk on the US political system. I'm Pranav Gupta, a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Our guest for today's session is Miss Nandini Narayan. Nandini is currently working as Member Services and Outreach Associate in Congressman Pete Aguilar's office. In the past, she has worked in the office of Congressman Ro Khanna and Congressman T.J. Cox in various capacities. Nandini is also a board member of the Women's Congressional Staff Association. A very warm welcome to you, Nandini, for today's session.
Thank you so much.
So, Nandini, the format for today's talk is going to be that I would request you to give some opening remarks on the topic for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and after that we have a bunch of questions from Indian students studying all across the country, and then we can go over these questions that have been sent to us by students.
Great. So looking just as a broad overview, and also, hi, I'm Nandini Narayan. I work in Congressman Pete Aguilar's vice chair office. So I'm part of the Democratic Caucus staff. So looking at a broad overview of the US political system, I'm sure a majority of people know that we have three different branches of government. We have our legislative branch, we have our executive branch, and we have our judicial branch. The legislative branch works as an arm to create laws. The executive branch works as essentially an arm to carry out the laws, and the judicial branch essentially works to evaluate the laws within the courts and its legality as we pass legislation. Each of the branches not only work off of each other and each other's goals, but they also work as a check and balance system towards making sure that everything is constitutional. So the president has the power to veto any bills that Congress passes. Congress has the ability to reject nominees or political agendas that any president might have. And then the judicial branch can overturn any law that is deemed unconstitutional and can also overturn certain presidential appointments, but that has not happened in recent history. Beyond that, each of the branches really have, I would say, their own specialties. We look to especially when we have control over the White House, and as a Democrat, over the White House, the Senate, and the House, we really look to have a unified message, not only for the US, but behind a lot of the policies that we build. You'll see too that certain bills and certain pieces of legislation, along with confirmations and other things that the Senate might do, does actually require a bipartisan vote. So even if one party is in control, if that party doesn't have, over 2/3 majority of the seats in the House or over 60 seats in the Senate, there is a forced bipartisan effort that is also built into the law to make sure that the government is very representative of the United States of America, the people that have been elected. But yeah, I'm open to any and all questions. My job, I've primarily only worked in the United States House of Representatives for, again, various different members in various capacities. US House members, I think, have a very unique position to be very plugged into their constituencies and how laws really truly do affect what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis in any requests that are made for constituents' aid for a federal agency. The Senate is structured a little differently. They have more of a broader oversight of their states. I personally love the House of Representatives. It's a lot of direct contact with not only members of Congress, but with your constituency. So you do keep your ear to the ground very closely as to what is happening on the state level. And yeah, open to all questions.
Thank you, Nandini. So I think so. What I've done is I've sort of tried to divide the questions based on the three branches. And I think we'll first start with the presidency. So something that like we often hear that US is a presidential system, but for the benefit of our audience, mostly students coming from India who are used to a parliamentary system of government, like could you give a brief overview of what is a presidential system of government in the US and how is the president elected?
So let's start with how the president is elected because it is a lot of people think that we have directly elected presidents just because, one of the first countries in the world to open up, one of the first democracies in the world to really have a directly elected or an elected president. But he's not directly elected. So essentially what we do is we have an electoral college system. So when a state and so this is we have our primaries. Typically in like March, April, and all starting March, April, and go all throughout a presidential election year. Um, and so in the primaries, we decide our top Democratic contender and our top Republican contender because we have a very built-in two-party system, which has basically been since the founding of the United States of America, since we declared independence. We so after the primaries and we have our two top contenders and going into the general election, each state is essentially given a number of electoral votes that are represented in physical human beings that actually do go to um, you've seen it on TV in the House of Representatives where those physical electoral votes are actually physically cast and all certified and voted on and all of that. So in the electoral college system, we have we always say like the numbers to hit are a little different. Um, so whoever wins the majority of the electoral college votes, which the votes are or the amount of votes per state are actually designated upon the country's amount of people, so the population in every single state. So it's the way it's for it to like work functionally is more in the like lens of civics. We don't necessarily want a state that has a very, very low population to have too much of a power over states that have very high populations, which is why, you've seen in recent history where the popular, like the most like directly elected popular vote candidate sometimes is not the one that you'll see in the White House. I mean, you saw it happen under Clinton. You saw it, Clinton versus Trump. You saw it happen, I believe, Gore versus Bush. So the electoral college is it's like another built-in check and balance system that we have. So the electors then, meet at this huge conference and they elect the next president of the United States. And whoever wins that majority, ends up in the White House. But there's actually another check and balance system also built in, which you probably saw on January 6th. The Senate and the House both have to meet to certify the election. And this happens with every single presidency. You can actually look up all of the videos on live.house.gov. They have all of the past videos of everything that happens on the floor, but you can look up the election certification process for Obama's election, Bush's election, all of the different elections, all of different presidential elections. Um, and so after the election's certified, then the president is formally elected, but he's still, the president-elect until he is sworn in. I believe it's January 20th. I always forget what the constitutional mandate is, but there is actually a constitutional mandate on what day the president has to be sworn in.
So, Nandini, you mentioned about primaries. You mentioned about primary elections. So, could you talk a bit about what are primaries and caucuses? What's the difference between a primary and a caucus, and who gets to vote in these, and what is the whole process like?
So, so this actually is actually very variant state by state. Because the way California, where my home state, where the way we do primaries is very, very, very different than the way that say like South Dakota or even Ohio actually does primaries. California, we have what we call jungle primaries. It's open primaries. So anyone and everyone is kind of just like in the primary pool, Dem or Republican. If you're a registered Democrat or Republican in the state of California, you get to vote in either one of the primaries. Um, and literally it can be the ballot for the primary candidate, especially in California, it can be 20, 30 people wide since we have such an open primary system. Whereas in other states, they actually will sometimes pre-primary will either caucus or they'll have different Democratic clubs. And this happens in like some counties in the Bay Area for lower level seats, where the Democratic Party of a certain region will choose their top contender. And this also happens in like places like Arizona, New Mexico. Um, and so the caucus in itself will choose their top contender for the primary and essentially put all of their effort and push behind that one candidate. So that way you are kind of going into the primary with more of a unified voice. Said less infighting within a party, which never plays well in the press. And so, again, very different from state by state. But the primaries really just serve as a system to show who would be the top contender that the constituents would like to see, not the part in California, at least where we have open primaries, like who would be the top contender for the constituency, not necessarily what the party might think nationally. And we saw that a lot, I think, in past presidential and also probably when Obama was also being elected during the primaries. You saw a lot of states that might have swung Clinton, but Obama was the national candidate at the end of the day. So same thing with like this cycle in California, Bernie Sanders was actually the front runner in the California primary, but he was not the national candidate. So it's another not only level of like checks and balances because the way someone thinks in California may not necessarily be the same way a Democrat in Virginia thinks. And so it again is like it really brings a lot of like civics and equality to our election process.
Okay, that's very interesting. So the idea that every state will have very different processes, and these could be starkly different across states.
Yes, which is why constitutional law is so important and the Voting Rights Act is so important because it does vastly vary, voter registration and everything from voter registration to your ability to receive a ballot, all the way to how people are picked for, which seats, even at the local level, all the way to the local to, presidential level. It all very much varies. And, there are some elected positions in some states that other states don't have. So the built-in checks and balances really helps with making sure that A, your vote is counted, and then B, you actually do have a voice in your vote. You don't get to, you're not completely, I guess, ignored by people higher up that just want to make the decisions.
Okay. So Nadim, now let's move on to the US Congress. So you gave us a brief idea about the difference between the House and the Senate and a brief idea about the difference about their functions. But we just wanted to know, like some students wanted to have some clarity on like how is the process for electing members of how does the process for electing members for both of these, how does that vary, or is there a similar process for electing members to the House and to the Senate? How does that process vary? What does how does the constitution of both these chambers, how does that vary?
So the one nice thing is in the Constitution, there are constitutional mandates for how many seats are in the U.S. chamber or for the House of Representatives and how many are in the U.S. chamber for the Senate. And so looking at the Senate, I would say it's a little bit easier. It's really just two senators per state, no matter how big or small your state is, which again acts as a very big check and balance system because it doesn't matter, if you have a extremely populated state like California, where you have two senators, just like a very small populated state like Wyoming, where you still have two senators, or Alaska, like, who lives in Alaska? Though Don Young would say everybody wants to like live in Alaska. He's the congressman from Alaska. But so in the Senate, oh, sorry if you hear the bells. They're going into congressional recess for a little bit until we have a couple of meetings. But anyway, so we have two senators per every single state. So you have 100 senators overall in the Senate. And in the House of Representatives, you have 435 U.S. House of Representatives. Now, theirs are actually a little different, and we have to go back to the census for that. So every 10 years, the United States does a census where we like actually go, and I think India does this too, where we go and like we count all the families. And I think a lot of the world does this because data is very important. It's how we enact all of our legislation. So for the House of Representatives, for the 435 seats, it's all done on what we call apportionment. So first, the census, Census Bureau goes and they do all of their accumulation of data, who lives where, what population lives where, as much information as people would like to disclose, we love, because that's literally what creates our bills and laws. And then, so the first thing the Census Bureau will do is after they take the census, they'll then look at, how many people are living per state. And so that's the first portion of apportionment. So, then they'll assign, you saw actually the census numbers come out this year recently in March for apportionment in the United States, and you'll see certain states lost a congressional seat in the House, and some states gained a congressional seat in the House because the state's population increased or decreased. So this on the state, on like the Census Bureau federal level, that's the only portion that the federal level plays into the U.S. House of Representatives and how many seats are allotted for every state. That's the only level. It's just the allotment of seats per state. And so like take California, for example, because we have had our economy and just like cost of living, people have moved out of California. So 10 years ago, we were assigned 53 seats. This upcoming election cycle, we were only assigned 52. So we did lose a seat. Whereas Texas, where a lot of the tech companies are actually moving to in Houston, they actually gained a couple of seats. And so the federal government steps in there and they tell every single state exactly how many seats they will have for the next congressional cycle. And this happens every 10 years. Then the states actually, and so this is, again, this process varies very much from like state to state, which is why I would say congressional district maps go to the Supreme Court, not often, but fairly often. So then at the state level, and so California does it a little differently than some of the states, but we have an independent redistricting commission where we take, I want to say it's 4 Dems, 4 Republicans, and 3 independents, but it might be 3, 3, and 2. But so we essentially take the same number of Republicans, same number of Dems, and like a select few independents that have worked in the political sphere, but have never really worked for, they haven't worked like an elected official in the last 10 years, or like they're not, even if they are party affiliated, they're not directly elected themselves either. So the Independent Redistricting Commission is literally, at least for California, they're the ones who draw the maps, which has actually worked quite well for California, I think. We had implemented it, I want to say, I guess now 20 years ago. And it honestly worked very, very well. It really carved our seats into more community, and I guess you could say like more community, more city, and more county oriented seats. So that way the shared issues, so like, if you're in the Central Valley of California, your big issue is going to be farming and farmland. That doesn't necessarily resonate to where I'm from, the Bay Area, in Congressman Rokunda's district, where it's a lot of tech, and it's very urban. So the Redistricting Commission really focuses on trying to keep populations that are similar, not necessarily similar like demographic or ethnicity wise, but just similar work and like functionality for the state wise together. And so we have an independent redistricting commission, and they draw out the maps. But then in other states, like I believe in Pennsylvania, also other states of North Carolina also, where the legislature has the ability to draw the maps. And so these are the ones that are typically also challenged in court. And so again, since this is like completely up to the state on like how they choose to do it, federal government does not have a hand in this whatsoever. This is where you'll hear the term gerrymandering quite a lot tossed around, especially this year because the maps are out. Well, the maps will be coming out in a couple of weeks, and they'll be staggered for all the different states. They have the ability, because it's, again, the state legislature that decides. So whoever is controlling the state legislature essentially has the ability to draw out maps that are more favorable for whoever is in control of the state legislature. And so Pennsylvania got in trouble with this a couple years ago, and so did North Carolina. North Carolina was actually forced to redraw their maps because the Supreme Court actually deemed it unconstitutional. And this was actually this took place 3 years ago, but it was in effect for the last election cycle at the end of 2020. So North Carolina, since the state's maps were deemed unconstitutional, they have to go back and redraw the maps. And the different congressional seats, so I would say roughly anywhere from about 750,000 to 800,000 people are represented in each congressional seat in the House of Representatives. Unless you're a state like Alaska, where only, like, I don't know how many people actually live in Alaska. I was going to say only 100, but I know there's more than 100 people. And so same thing with Wyoming, where actually the population of the state is way less than what a congressional district, like roughly the number is. So essentially every congressional member is sent to Congress representing a little less than 1 million people. And they so then the maps for a place like North Carolina, and since the legislature has control, whoever, it's usually a Republican legislature in North Carolina, same thing usually in Pennsylvania. They typically will draw the maps in a way that it will favor blocks of Republican voters, and so, or clump together blocks of Republican voters in areas that might not necessarily always be voting Democratic or Republican. So that way you can actually physically like draw out, like, here's a group of Republicans and here's a group of Democrats, but here's another group of Republicans, and they can literally draw a map that doesn't have to do at all with the state's functionality or the needs of like an urban versus rural area at all. And they really just focus on how many seats we can send to the U.S. House of Representatives that are part of that party. Some states, like I would say Pennsylvania, where even though the legislature is Republican held, sometimes it's in recent history, they have tended to actually elect a Democratic governor. And so the governor will have veto power over the maps that are submitted to the state legislature for approval. And he or she will be able to apply the checks and balances system at the federal or at the state level for the maps. But not all the states have that. Some states truly just have like Republican control across the board. And so that's where also the Supreme Court can step in and check on the constitutionality of a map.
So what is evident, Nandini, from all that you said, is that a lot of action is actually happening at the state level in terms of the political system.
Yeah.
So could you give our audience some idea about like how does the political system vary at the state level? So in the sense, is the organization of state legislatures similar to the US Congress in the sense that are state legislatures also bicameral? How does at the state level are the powers of a governor very similar to the kind of powers the president would enjoy at the federal level? So what is the political system like at the state level?
So again, I'm only from California, so I can really only speak about California. But across the board, I would say, at the state level, the governor's power, especially if you're a large state like California, you do typically have a lot of power. And you'll see that the reason for the states having the right to, really not only draw their own maps and like choose their own functionality is because it's written in our Constitution. States' rights is a huge, huge thing that the founders actually fought for. because of not only landowner powers and different kinds of things, but you have to remember that pre-independence, each area was essentially governed by a local governor, a local person. And so that same idea of, my local person knows my needs the most and understands the issues of that certain region the most was very much implemented when the Constitution was written, and why we implemented states' rights. Which is why you'll also see, from state to state, laws vary. The federal government, we have like top level laws on top level issues, but from state to state, the way that a law is carried out, the different types of laws. I'm just going to use the most common example that's in the mail right now, in the news right now, but legalizing marijuana. State to state very muchly varies because at the federal level, there is not a law that is overarching for the entire US. And so I would say how the states governors are kind of perceived in each state is they do have control over what happens and resides within their state. Which is also why you'll see, especially during COVID, certain governors either, or even, certain mayors, disseminating down will implement some sort of vaccine mandate or mask mandates. And a lot of those directives are issued by the governor's office per state. And even if the federal government, has a mandate, it doesn't necessarily always have to be followed by the state level because, again, we really do believe in states' rights in the US government, which sometimes does allow for a lot of diverse views.
Yeah, I think that is definitely one of the big differences between, say, the Indian political system and the US political system. While both countries have federalism, the nature of federalism differs sharply. So US has what we call a coming together federalism, where different constituent units are coming together and pooling their powers together, as opposed to India, which is more of a holding together federalism. Now, moving on to now, I think this the next question that we have. Perhaps it's driven more by popular media because a lot of information about the American political system for many Indian students is based on what they see in movies and web series, TV shows. So, what is the meaning of filibuster? So, what is this procedure for filibuster in the U.S. Congress?
um, so So filibuster is, I would say it's a little complicated. I think a lot of people just think that it can happen at like any point in time. And I think technically, like, even though the filibuster is something that is in Senate procedure and written into the um, Senate rules. The House also has their own version of the filibuster, which I will get into, which is actually kind of interesting. And I have seen it implement, and I've actually been physically in the U.S. House of Representatives when I've seen it kind of implemented. So a filibuster is an unlimited time of debate that can be at any point in time. The Senate is actually in session and they're debating, anything from a rule to a cloture motion to an amendment, to a bill. Um, you can have the ability to filibuster. Um, and it's known as a procedure, like a procedural, I guess you could say, um, procedural, like that's not really a motion because you just kind of stand up there and you get to filibuster and pontificate for however long you choose to. Um, but there is the ability to actually, and this is the part of the argument which I don't think you see a lot in the news, there is an ability also written into the Senate rules where you can actually procedurally close or end a filibuster period if you have two-thirds majority of the vote in the Senate, which typically I don't know how long it's been since we've seen that for either party. And it's kind of a catch 22 because the the filibuster is something that you won't really necessarily see because there's a lot of rules when you are filibustering. Um, you have to be standing and talking for X amount of time and you can't take a break. And like there's like a lot of different like weird rules with like the filibuster, and you have to be germane. Like there's a lot of small little tiny rules. So you won't necessarily see it unless it is a really, really big issue. On the flip side, though, on the House, we have what I deem kind of like a filibuster, and I've seen it used once in my time period during the, I want to say it was during the first term of President Trump during the first year, when the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, was, I think, on the House floor for, it was like a record-setting House floor speech. It was like 8 hours long. And essentially what she had done was taken stories submitted by members of the Democratic Party. And she just went up there and she talked about how the ACA was benefiting all of these different constituents in the US. And she had, over like hundreds and hundreds of submissions. So she was literally on the House floor just speaking for 8 hours. And so in Democratic leadership on the House side, and this is also true for the Senate, they have what we call the magic minute. So typically on the House side, we have a lot of strict procedures on how long a speech can be, when a speech can be given, whether it can be 1 minute, 5 minute, how much time is allotted for debate. But leadership, which essentially is a speaker, majority leader, minority leader, and whips of both parties, or whips of whichever majority minority is in control, they have the ability to just, even if they're like designated 1 minute of time during a debate, they have the ability to talk for as long as they want. And sometimes, this it very rarely happens, especially in the House. But if an issue is as important, especially like the ACA, the if the time of debate, not only extends beyond like the hour allotted, but also goes to 8, 9 hours, the vote that was scheduled for that same day might not necessarily happen because members have either flown home or they've left the building. So that's kind of typically the reason why you ever want to filibuster, is because you don't want a vote to occur. You want to use up so much time that you just don't want the vote to occur.
And, and and if the vote doesn't occur on the same day, does it automatically get rescheduled for the following day, or the next day's original schedule takes on and the vote then gets delayed?
Not necessarily, to be honest. The it really truly doesn't have to be rescheduled for the next day. It can be honestly rescheduled for whenever. And especially if, the party that was opposing whatever kind of legislation or filibustering, if they're fearful that it'll happen again, they'll go back to the drawing board and they'll try to seek a solution, because nobody wants to force anybody to stand on their feet for X amount of time and just speak and essentially waste that. It's just a waste of like floor time. It's like a waste of legislative actionable time that we could have. And we want there to be a productive legislative calendar. So it's not something that we typically like to ever see, and we do try to avoid it at all costs, which is why you haven't really seen too much of a filibuster issue this Congress so far.
So, Nandini, continue. Let's talking about the U.S. Congress. So, key person in the U.S. political system is the Speaker of the House. So, what are the powers of the Speaker of the House typically?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of just like general, like procedural things. She, because currently it's a she, but he or she, they have the ability to, swear members in, a lot of like the procedural things. They get to designate members on the floor for time. They also get to, open the House chamber and a lot of like the procedural things that happen on a day-to-day basis. They also have the ability to, appoint members to committees that are part of their party. And they do also have the ability to bring any bill to the floor at any point in time, which I think you saw a lot more during COVID, just because of the, I guess, not only the urgency, but the expeditious manner, like how we needed to get a lot of the funding back, I mean, or a lot of like dollars back into people's pockets to keep the US economy very invigorated. So they have the ability to bring any floor vote that they want at any time. They also have, I would say, a very a big role in shaping the House rules. So there is, and this is actually really interesting if like anyone ever wants to dig into the House rules, but everything that you do on the floor is actually designated or and within the House rules that is actually passed at the beginning of each Congress, right after everybody's sworn in. And everything from the way you dress, from the words that you can use, like it's all parliamentarian procedure that a lot of it was borrowed from the British. But everything is designated in the rules and how you conduct yourself. And so they also have the ability to suspend the rules. They have the ability to, force certain things that don't necessarily have to be within the House rules because they're the Speaker of the House. Lots of special powers.
And you mentioned about the speaker appointing members to committees. So how powerful or how influential are House committees when it comes to drafting new legislation? Or what are the kind of impact do that committee reports have on bills and legislations?
A very important. Doesn't really matter which committee you sit on. Everything is very important. I always thought that previously, small business was usually never like and I wouldn't say like a very heavy committee. Small businesses, we have like levels of different committees, like an A level committee, so an exclusive committee, a B level committee, and a C level committee. And small business was always typically, a C level committee, not too much gravitas in the committee. And then COVID happened and we had the PPP Act and implemented an entire program within the Small Business Administration that was just created kind of out of thin air. And then Small Business Committee became really busy very quickly. So I have now learned to never misjudge any of the committee's importance. But every single committee has their own charge and their jurisdiction of what not only department or I guess you could say like associate departments they handle funding and directives for, but they also have the ability to hold hearings on issues that are under their jurisdiction, to investigate, yes, but also to kind of bring light and hear differing opinions from different parts of the US on particular issues. And a lot of those hearings and a lot of those investigations, they lead to, you know, huge pieces of legislation. I mean, we can take, for example, the House Armed Services Committee, um, where they have an authorization bill in their jurisdiction, a 1 year reauthorization bill every year. And before they ever draft that piece of legislation, each of the subcommittees, and even the full committee, they'll hold a number of hearings and investigations, and asked a lot of U.S. military members to come in and testify about not only their needs on the funding portion, but also what they can implement in the armed services space, um, when it comes to military code of conduct, and different areas of the military. So
So thank you so much for touching upon the congressional hearings, but that was going to be my next question because a lot of people, we've all seen many recordings and even live telecasts of these hearings, but a lot of students, of course, they had limited idea about what these usually entail. Now,
mhm.
moving on to the third branch of the state, American judiciary. So, Natalie, how is the US judiciary structure, at least at the federal level? So there's the US Supreme Court? How are judges to the U.S. Supreme Court elected? How are judges appointed? What's the structure like of the American judiciary?
Um, so the Supreme Court, so that's a huge topic. But the Supreme Court, at least when it comes to the amount of members, and how they're appointed. So appointments are typically, I mean, they're always appointed by the president. The president has a nominee that they would like to see appointed to the United States Supreme Court. So this is another sense of checks and balances. The court, if there's ever a vacancy, if someone has passed away, unfortunately, or has decided to retire. There have been Supreme Court justices that have retired, like Sandra Day O'Connor. She's still alive and well, but she is retired. Or if you have a member that's passed away, just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the president has the ability to nominate someone, and typically it's someone, I would say, that is of that president's party, or shares. I mean, the Supreme Court is kind of looked at as, whichever judge is appointed isn't necessarily like Democrat or Republican. But if you look at their judicial history, if you look at their judicial history, you'll see, I guess, what political sphere that they most identify with. On the other hand, also with the presidential nominee, the Senate has to confirm the Supreme Court justice. And so that's typically where sometimes the wheels come off the train, because getting to not only the confirmation process, but actually being confirmed as a Supreme Court judge is a very, very, very long process. There's a lot of different hearings. The Anyone can really ask a question of a nominee, but the Judiciary Committee has, the first kind of structure of really, really diving into how the possible nominee would hypothetically or has previously judged on certain issues, and how then their judgments based on precedent will affect possible cases that could be coming up to the Supreme Court based on what's already on the calendar and on the docket.
So you mentioned about how the appointment requires a Senate confirmation. Now, I presume, and this is another related to a question that we have about divided government. So what is it? How does this political system function when you have a case of, say, Senate majority being with a particular party and the president being from another part from a different party? How does the political system operate under such scenarios?
A lot of wheeling and dealing at it. Typically, and so this became a very, very large issue during the last term of President Obama, when we did have a vacancy. And unfortunately, the nominee for the president, Merrick Garland at the time, who now has a different position in this presidency, but he was the nominee, and he was never put up for a confirmation hearing or anything, really. Forget even the vote, because the parties differed. The Senate was controlled by the Republicans, and the White House was controlled by a Democrat. So when it comes to the confirmation process, and this is, I think, probably true of any future president or any past president, it can come to a complete standstill because, the Supreme Court, known as the highest court in the land, and since how much power they do have, and since there's not a constitutional mandate on how many seats have to be within the Supreme Court justice system and how many justices we have to have, you can leave a seat open for as long as people would want. Or I guess as long as whichever party is in control chooses to hold a confirmation hearing, control of the Senate.
Okay.
Yes, it
So
can come to a total standstill, absolute standstill.
Nandini, that was all. Those were all the questions that we had from students across the country. Once again, on behalf of Indian students in US and India Student Hub, I would like to thank you for taking out your valuable time for today's session. I think what students would really like or appreciate is that you not only gave us an idea about the details and institutions and procedures of the American system, but also gave insights from your own experience and observations over the years. Thank you so much, Nandini.
Thank you for having me.